An 85-year-old woman married a 25-year-old man. Then this happened. Story time. Margaret was an 85-year-old woman who lived a quiet life in a small town. For many years, she had been a widow. Her husband, whom she had loved dearly, had passed away long ago, and since then, her days were mostly filled with routine. She would spend mornings in her little garden, afternoons reading books by the window, and evenings listening to old songs that reminded her of her youth. To many people in town, she was simply a sweet old lady who kept to herself. But deep inside, Margaret often felt a heavy loneliness. Life had slowed down for her, and even though she smiled when neighbors greeted her, she wished she had someone to share her heart with again. One day, out of boredom, Margaret decided to try something new. Her granddaughter had once taught her how to use the internet, and she had even set up a simple email account for her. Margaret remembered this and, with a little effort, she managed to log in. What began as small curiosity turned into a new habit. She started exploring forums and online communities where people discussed books, history, and life experiences. It was through one of these online groups that she first met Jason, a young man of only 25. Jason was nothing like the people around her age. He was energetic, curious, and always full of questions. He loved literature, much like Margaret, and the two quickly found themselves in long conversations about novels, poetry, and even old movies. Margaret couldn't believe how comfortable she felt talking to someone who was 60 years younger than her. Jason, on the other hand, was surprised to find such wisdom and warmth in Margaret's words. At first, it was just friendly chatting. They exchanged thoughts about books and sent each other favorite quotes. But slowly, their conversations began to grow deeper. Jason would share his struggles about being young and uncertain about his future, and Margaret would share stories of her past, giving him advice from her life experiences. Somewhere along the way, they began to laugh together. They teased each other, told little jokes, and shared secrets they hadn't told anyone else. The friendship felt unusual, but it was also genuine. Weeks turned into months, and their bond grew stronger. Jason began calling Margaret on the phone, and their talks would go on for hours. He admired her sharp mind and gentle humor. She admired his kindness and the way he listened to her, never treating her as just an old woman. For Margaret, it was like a door to a new world had opened. She no longer felt invisible or forgotten, instead, she felt alive again. Eventually, Jason asked if he could visit her in person. Margaret was nervous at first. She thought, what would people think if they saw me with a young man like him? But her heart told her that Jason was sincere, so she agreed. When the day came, Jason showed up at her doorstep with flowers in his hands and a wide smile on his face. Margaret looked at him and couldn't help but laugh. He was so young, full of energy, and yet so respectful. It didn't feel strange, it felt natural. From that day on, their meetings became frequent. They would sit in her garden, talking for hours about everything from the past to the future. Sometimes they went for small walks in the park, where Jason pushed her wheelchair when she grew tired. They laughed so much that passers-by often turned their heads, wondering what an elderly woman and a young man could possibly be joking about. One evening, while watching the sunset from her porch, Jason suddenly said, "Margaret, you've changed my life. I don't care about what anyone says, but I feel closer to you than I have ever felt to anyone." His words caught her off guard, and her heart raced. She had not felt such emotions in decades. Margaret didn't know how to respond at first, but as she looked into his eyes, she realized she felt the same way. What began as friendship had turned into something more powerful, something neither of them had expected. They were in love. It was not an easy thing for Margaret to accept. She was 85, and Jason was only 25. The age difference was shocking, not only to society but even to herself. She worried about what people would say, what her family would think, and how their lives could ever fit together. But each time those doubts filled her mind, Jason's presence pushed them away. He would remind her, love doesn't come with numbers. It comes with honesty, care, and connection, and that's what we have. The more time they spent together, the more inseparable they became. Jason began visiting her daily, helping her with chores, cooking meals for her, and even teaching her how to use modern technology better. Margaret, in return, gave him guidance, wisdom, and the kind of love that was patient and unconditional. When neighbors began noticing Jason's visits, whispers started spreading through the town. People couldn't understand why a young man would spend so much time with a woman old enough to be his grandmother. Some assumed Jason was only interested in her money, while others thought he was simply playing with her emotions. Margaret heard the gossip, and sometimes it made her cry in private. But Jason always comforted her, holding her hand and saying, "Let them talk. We know the truth." Despite the criticism, their bond only grew stronger. One afternoon, Jason took Margaret out for a quiet walk near the lake. The water sparkled under the sun, and the air felt peaceful. He suddenly stopped, turned to her, and said, "Margaret, I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She never imagined that at this stage of her life, someone would propose marriage to her. Tears filled her eyes, and though she hesitated for a moment, deep down she already knew her answer. She whispered, "Yes." That decision was the beginning of a story that would shock everyone around them. An 85-year-old woman marrying a 25-year-old man was something people could hardly believe. But for Margaret and Jason, it was not about proving anything to the world, it was about choosing love, no matter how unusual it seemed. And so, their journey toward marriage began, filled with excitement, doubt, and courage. When Margaret and Jason finally decided to marry, the first storm they faced was not from strangers but from their own families. Margaret had 3 children, all of them older than Jason himself. When she told them about her decision, their reactions were filled with shock and disbelief. Her eldest daughter stared at her in silence for a long moment before saying, "Mother, this cannot be serious. He is younger than my own son. How can you even think of marrying someone his age?" Her other children echoed the same disbelief. They worried that Jason's intentions were not genuine. "He must be after your money," her son said firmly. "He's too young to understand what marriage even means. He will leave you as soon as he gets what he wants." The words hurt Margaret deeply. She had expected resistance, but she had not expected her own children to question her ability to make choices for herself. For so long, they had seen her as a fragile old woman who needed to be taken care of, but now, for the first time in years, she felt strong, alive, and independent. She tried to explain. She told them that Jason was kind, hardworking, and caring. She reminded them that he had never asked her for money, nor had he shown any interest in material things. But no matter what she said, her children refused to believe her. Jason's family was no less surprised. His parents were confused and worried. His friends teased him, saying he was throwing away his youth. "Why would you marry someone who is closer to 90 than 30, one friend laughed. Another said, "You're making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life." Their words were sharp, but Jason did not let them shake his decision. He had already chosen Margaret, and nothing could change his heart. News of their unusual relationship spread quickly in town. Neighbors whispered about it behind closed doors, and some even said it openly to their faces. Margaret could feel the stares when she walked outside with Jason. Some people shook their heads as if disappointed, while others smirked and muttered under their breath. At the grocery store, a woman leaned toward her friend and whispered just loud enough for Margaret to hear, "What could he possibly see in her?" At first, Margaret was embarrassed. She thought of staying inside, avoiding the world, and hiding her relationship. But Jason refused to let her feel ashamed. "Why should we hide?" he said gently. We are not doing anything wrong. Love is not something to be hidden, it's something to be proud of. Margaret slowly began to see the truth in his words. She had already lived most of her life according to what society expected of her. She had raised her children, been a devoted wife, and carried herself with dignity in her community. Now, in her final years, she felt she had earned the right to live as her heart desired. Still, the criticism weighed heavily on both of them. There were evenings when Margaret cried quietly, wondering if she was being selfish. Jason, too, sometimes felt the burden of people's judgment. His friends mocked him behind his back, and even his closest companions doubted him. But every time doubts appeared, he reminded himself of the peace and joy he found with Margaret. That feeling was worth more than all the approval in the world. The couple began preparing for their wedding, but it was not an easy journey. Margaret's children refused to attend at first. They told her she was making a mistake and that they could not support it. Jason's parents were hesitant, torn between wanting their son's happiness and struggling to understand his choice. The gossip in town grew louder as the wedding date approached. Some called it foolish, others called it scandalous. But for Jason and Margaret, it was simply love. One evening, a neighbor visited Margaret. This woman was someone who had lived next door for decades and had known Margaret through all her ups and downs. She sat with her on the porch and said, "People will always talk, my dear. They talked when you were young, they talk now, and they will talk after we are gone. But at the end of the day, only you know what brings you happiness. If this young man loves you truly, then hold on to him. Don't let the voices of others silence your heart." Those words gave Margaret the courage she needed. She decided she would no longer defend her decision to anyone. Instead, she would live her life openly, with Jason by her side. As the wedding day approached, something unexpected happened. Jason's sincerity began to show through in small ways. He worked extra hours at his job to pay for parts of the ceremony. He helped Margaret's children with small tasks, fixing things in their houses, and offering help without being asked. He never demanded anything in return, never asked for money or favors. Slowly, Margaret's children began to notice his genuine care. Though they still doubted him, a small part of their hearts softened. Meanwhile, Margaret's health was not perfect. Some days were difficult, and she needed rest and assistance. Jason never complained. He was patient, gentle, and always ready to support her. Even those who once doubted him began to wonder if their judgments had been too quick. But the voices of society did not quiet down easily. On the morning of the wedding, a few townspeople even suggested it was wrong for such a marriage to happen. They stood outside the little church, whispering to each other. Margaret walked past them slowly, holding Jason's hand tightly. She heard the whispers, but for the first time, she did not care. Her eyes were fixed on the happiness waiting ahead. Inside the church, not many people attended at first. Some seats were empty, showing the disapproval of those who chose to stay away. But when the ceremony began, something remarkable happened. Jason's parents, who had been uncertain until the last moment, walked in quietly and sat down. A little later, Margaret's eldest daughter also entered, followed by her other children. They had decided that even if they did not understand their mother's choice, they could not abandon her on such an important day. The ceremony was simple but filled with emotion. Jason stood tall, looking at Margaret with pure love in his eyes. Margaret, though aged and fragile, glowed with a happiness she had not felt in years. When they exchanged vows, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that their connection was real. By the time they walked out as husband and wife, even some of the critics outside softened their gaze. They still might not have agreed with the marriage, but they could not deny the joy on Margaret's face or the devotion in Jason's eyes. The days that followed were not free of challenges. Society did not change overnight. Some people still gossiped, and not everyone was willing to accept them. But the wedding had shown something powerful, that their love was strong enough to withstand judgment. And slowly, people began to see that what they had was not a passing fancy but a true partnership built on care and respect. For Margaret and Jason, the wedding was not just about becoming husband and wife, it was about standing together against doubt, criticism, and fear. It was about proving, first to themselves and then to others, that love can exist in the most unexpected places, between the most unlikely people. The wedding had been small but meaningful, and for Margaret and Jason, it felt like the beginning of an entirely new chapter in life. They returned to Margaret's modest home, hand in hand, with hearts full of hope. For Margaret, it felt as if her quiet, lonely house had suddenly come alive. For Jason, it felt like stepping into a role that was both unusual and extraordinary. The first days of their married life were full of excitement. They spent hours talking, laughing, and sharing meals together. Jason would prepare breakfast in the mornings, sometimes bringing it to her in bed, and Margaret would smile like a young bride. She would often tell him stories from her youth, how she met her first husband, how she raised her children, and the many struggles she had faced. Jason listened closely, as if each word was a precious treasure. But soon, reality began to show itself. Married life was never meant to be easy, and theirs came with unique challenges. Margaret was 85 years old, and her health often required attention. She grew tired quickly, needed medicines on time, and sometimes felt weak. Jason, being much younger, had energy that Margaret could not always keep up with. He wanted to go for long walks, explore new places, and sometimes join his friends. Yet he often chose to stay by her side, holding her hand and making sure she was comfortable. There were moments when Margaret worried she was holding him back. Late at night, while Jason slept beside her, she would lie awake and wonder if he would eventually regret marrying her. She thought about how different their worlds were, his full of possibilities and hers nearing its final chapters. But every time she voiced her fears, Jason reassured her. He would take her hand and say, "You are not holding me back. You give me peace, comfort, and love. That's more than anything else in the world." Despite Jason's words, the outside world continued to cast shadows over their happiness. Neighbors still whispered when they saw Jason mowing the lawn or helping Margaret with groceries. At times, people even confronted Jason directly. "Why are you wasting your life?" one man asked him at the market. Jason ignored the remark, but later that evening, Margaret could see the hurt in his eyes. Margaret's children also struggled to accept their new reality. Though they had attended the wedding, they were far from comfortable with the marriage. On family gatherings, tension often filled the air. Her eldest daughter sometimes avoided speaking directly to Jason, while her son would ask sharp questions about his work, his income, and his future plans. Jason answered politely, never raising his voice, but the doubts were clear. Still, not everything was difficult. There were moments of pure joy that made all the struggles worthwhile. Jason often brought small surprises for Margaret: flowers from the garden, her favorite chocolates, or even a book she once mentioned in passing. On weekends, he would take her out for short drives in the countryside, where they watched the changing colors of the sky together. Margaret loved these drives. Sitting beside him, with the wind blowing gently through the window, she often felt decades younger. Inside their home, they created routines that gave them comfort. Jason would help with Margaret's medicines, making sure she never missed a dose. He learned how to cook her favorite traditional dishes, though he often joked about his clumsy attempts. Margaret, in return, taught him how to sew on loose buttons and how to prepare her secret recipe for apple pie. These small moments, though ordinary, were the threads that stitched their unusual marriage together. Yet challenges continued to appear. Jason's friends slowly drifted away, unable to understand his life choices. Invitations to parties became fewer, and he was often left out of gatherings. At times, he felt the loss of his social circle, but he never complained to Margaret. Instead, he poured his energy into building a new circle of life around her. Money was another challenge. Jason had a small job, and though Margaret had savings, she was careful not to let him depend on them. She wanted him to stand on his own, to prove to everyone including her children that his love was genuine. Jason understood this and worked harder, sometimes taking extra shifts to save money. When he came home tired, Margaret would massage his shoulders gently and remind him to take care of his health too. One afternoon, a small argument broke out between them. Margaret had insisted that Jason should spend more time with people his age, reminding him that he deserved a young, active life. Jason grew upset and said, "Why do you keep thinking I'll be happier without you? Don't you see I've already chosen this life with you?" His voice trembled, not from anger but from hurt. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she realized how deeply her doubts wounded him. From that day on, she promised herself to trust his love fully. Their marriage was not about perfection, it was about patience. Every day, they learned how to balance their differences. Jason learned how to slow down, to appreciate quiet evenings and simple joys. Margaret learned how to let go of fear, to accept that love could exist even in the most surprising ways. One of the happiest days of their married life came on Margaret's 86th birthday. Jason organized a small gathering at their home, inviting not just family but also neighbors. At first, many people hesitated to attend. But Jason's warm hospitality and Margaret's radiant smile changed the atmosphere. By the end of the evening, laughter filled the house, and even those who once doubted them found themselves softening. Margaret's children, too, began to notice Jason's efforts. They saw how he cared for their mother, how he respected her, and how he never once tried to take advantage of her wealth. Slowly, their suspicions started to fade. Though it took time, they eventually accepted that Jason was not their enemy but their mother's true companion. Through it all, Jason and Margaret discovered that marriage was not about the absence of problems but about facing them together. For every whisper of gossip, they had a moment of laughter. For every doubt, they had an act of kindness. And for every tear, they had a memory of joy to balance it. Their married life was far from ordinary, but it was real. It was built on shared meals, evening walks, quiet talks, and the simple comfort of knowing someone was there at the end of each day. Margaret often told Jason, "You've given me a second chance at happiness." Jason would reply, "And you've given me a reason to live with meaning." They did not know what the future would bring, but they had each other, and for both of them, that was enough. Months passed after the wedding, and life for Margaret and Jason slowly settled into a rhythm. They had faced criticism, whispers, and doubt, yet their bond had only grown stronger. Still, there remained one shadow over their marriage: the suspicion that Jason had married Margaret only for her money. This doubt weighed on Margaret's children most of all. No matter how many times they saw Jason care for their mother, deep down, they still wondered if his love was truly genuine. Jason knew this. He could see it in their eyes when they visited, in the cautious way they spoke to him, and in the cold pauses during conversations. Though he never argued back, the doubt hurt him deeply. He wanted to prove, not with words but with actions, that his love for Margaret was pure. One evening, while sitting with Margaret in the living room, Jason shared what was on his mind. "I don't want people to think I am here because of your money," he said softly. "I want to build something on my own, something that shows I can stand without taking anything from you." Margaret looked at him with concern. "But, Jason, you already do enough. You take care of me, you stay by my side, you make me happy. That's proof enough." Jason shook his head gently. "It may be enough for us, but it's not enough for the world. I want to show them who I truly am." That night, Jason stayed awake long after Margaret had fallen asleep. He thought about his skills, his dreams, and what he could do to create a future that was not tied to Margaret's savings. He remembered how much he loved fixing things, how he enjoyed repairing small gadgets for friends, and how people often praised his talent for detail. An idea began to form in his mind. Within weeks, Jason started working on a small business. He rented a tiny shop on the edge of town and set it up as a repair center for electronics and household items. At first, very few people trusted him. Some even whispered, "That's the young man who married the old lady for her money. Now he's trying to play businessman." Jason ignored the comments. He opened his shop every morning, worked long hours, and returned home late at night with tired hands but a hopeful heart. Margaret supported him in every way she could. She prepared his lunch, encouraged him when he felt worn out, and reminded him of the bigger picture. Sometimes she would visit the shop, sitting quietly in a chair while Jason worked, just to keep him company. Her presence gave him strength. The early days of the business were tough. Customers were rare, and the earnings were small. Some nights, Jason would stare at the empty cash box, wondering if he had made a mistake. But each time he felt discouraged, he thought of Margaret and how much it meant to him to prove himself. Slowly, word began to spread about his skill and honesty. People who gave him small jobs were impressed with his work. They told others, and little by little, the shop began to grow. Months later, Jason's business was running steadily. He was earning enough not only to cover his own needs but also to contribute to the household expenses. When Margaret's children saw this, they were surprised. They had expected him to live off their mother's money, but instead, he was working hard, sweating through long days, and standing on his own feet. One afternoon, Margaret's eldest son visited the shop without telling anyone. He pretended to be a customer, bringing in a broken radio. Jason did not recognize him at first and treated him like any other client. He carefully examined the radio, repaired it with patience, and charged only a fair price. When the son revealed his identity, Jason was shocked, but he remained calm. "I want you to know," Jason said quietly, "that I am here because I love your mother. I don't need her money. I just need her." The son did not respond immediately, but for the first time, he began to see Jason in a different light. Meanwhile, Margaret was watching Jason transform before her eyes. She had once feared that their age gap would hold him back, but now she saw how determined he was to create his own path. She admired his energy, his dedication, and the way he never let negativity stop him. At night, when he came home exhausted, she would remind him how proud she was. "You're proving them all wrong," she whispered one evening. Jason smiled, holding her hand. "I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for us." As Jason's reputation grew, the whispers in town slowly began to change. People who once mocked him started to respect him. Some even apologized for doubting him. The same neighbors who had once said, "He's only after her money," now said, "That young man truly cares for her. Look how hard he works." Margaret's children also began to soften. They saw how Jason treated their mother not just in public but in private moments too. He was gentle when helping her walk, patient when she grew tired, and cheerful when she felt sad. He never complained, never showed frustration. His love was steady, like a rock. One day, Margaret fell ill and needed to be taken to the hospital. Jason stayed by her side the entire time, sleeping on the uncomfortable chair next to her bed, holding her hand through the long nights, and making sure the nurses treated her with care. Her children witnessed this devotion with their own eyes. For the first time, they began to trust him fully. After Margaret recovered, her daughter said quietly to Jason, "I may not have understood you before, but I can see now that you love her truly. Thank you for being there for our mother." The words brought tears to Jason's eyes, for he had waited so long for her family's acceptance. From that point on, things began to change. The children no longer looked at him with suspicion. Neighbors greeted him with respect. Even Jason's own friends, who had once teased him, began to admire his determination. Margaret often said that Jason's little repair shop was more than just a business, it was the turning point that changed how everyone saw them. It showed the world that their marriage was not about convenience or money but about love and commitment. For Jason, the shop was proof to himself as well. He had faced doubt from every corner, but he had not given up. He had built something from the ground up, not for wealth but for dignity. And with Margaret by his side, cheering him on, he felt that nothing was impossible. Their life was still unusual to many, but now it was respected. What had once been the subject of gossip was now seen as a lesson that love is not about age, wealth, or appearances, but about sincerity and sacrifice. And so, their marriage moved into a new stage not defined by doubt, but by trust and acceptance. As time moved forward, Margaret and Jason's marriage began to settle into something that felt natural and peaceful. What once was met with shock and suspicion now started to be accepted by both family and community. The whispers that once filled the town grew softer, replaced by quiet respect. People realized that what Margaret and Jason shared was not a passing fancy but a love story built on care, patience, and truth. For Margaret, this late chapter in life was nothing less than a gift. At 85, she had thought her days of love and companionship were long gone. She had believed her story was already complete. Yet here she was, living with laughter, comfort, and the warmth of someone who loved her without condition. Often, she would sit in her garden with Jason beside her and think to herself, I have been given a second chance at happiness. That thought alone made her heart light. Jason, too, found his life transformed. He had once been uncertain about his future, unsure where he belonged or what purpose he should pursue. But through Margaret, he discovered not only love but also direction. Caring for her, building a life with her, and creating his small business had given him meaning. When people looked at him now, they no longer saw a confused young man, they saw someone steady, devoted, and strong. Their daily life was filled with small but precious routines. In the mornings, Jason prepared tea while Margaret sat by the window, watching the sunlight fall over the garden. They would talk about their plans for the day, sometimes as simple as cooking a new recipe together or visiting the park. In the evenings, they sat outside, watching the stars and sharing stories. Though their age difference remained wide, their hearts beat in rhythm, as if no years separated them at all. Margaret's children, who had once resisted the marriage, had now grown closer to Jason. They saw how genuinely he cared for their mother, and their mistrust had slowly been replaced with gratitude. Margaret's eldest daughter often said, I may not have understood it in the beginning, but I see now that you make her happy. That's what matters. The children began to invite Jason to family gatherings, and he was no longer treated as an outsider but as part of the family. Even the townspeople's view had changed. Where once there were stares and whispers, there were now smiles and polite greetings. Some people even came to Jason for advice, respecting the way he had built his little shop into a reliable business. Couples young and old looked at Margaret and Jason with curiosity, sometimes even admiration. Their unusual love story had become a quiet reminder to many that happiness can appear in the most unexpected places. One summer evening, Margaret and Jason hosted a small gathering at their home. Neighbors, friends, and family gathered in the backyard. The air was filled with laughter, the smell of food, and the gentle sound of music playing in the background. Margaret, sitting in her chair with Jason standing proudly beside her, looked around at the faces of those who once doubted them. She felt tears in her eyes, not from sadness but from overwhelming joy. She whispered to Jason, "Look how far we've come." Jason smiled and gently squeezed her hand. It was all worth it. Margaret knew she was in the twilight of her life. She was realistic, and she accepted that her years were limited. But instead of fearing the end, she embraced the present. She often told Jason, Each day with you feels like a blessing. I don't measure time in years anymore, I measure it in moments, and our moments are full. Jason, though much younger, understood her words deeply. He cherished each day, knowing that their time together was precious. Their story soon spread beyond the town. A local journalist wrote about them, describing their unusual yet beautiful marriage. The article was titled, "Love Beyond Age, The Story of Margaret and Jason." It captured the attention of many readers, and soon, letters and messages poured in from people around the region. Some wrote to say they were inspired, others shared how their story gave them courage to follow their own hearts. Margaret and Jason were surprised but touched. They never sought attention, yet their love had quietly touched lives beyond their own. As the years went by, Jason continued to prove his devotion. He expanded his repair shop into a small business with a few workers, but he never let success pull him away from Margaret. Every evening, no matter how busy his day had been, he returned home to sit with her, share a meal, and listen to her stories. Their love was steady, not flashy, and that was what made it so enduring. Margaret's health, however, gradually grew more fragile. There were days when she felt too weak to leave her bed. Jason cared for her with unwavering patience. He cooked her meals, read her favorite books aloud, and held her hand through sleepless nights. Margaret often told him, "You give me strength I never knew I had." He would smile and reply, "And you give me love I never knew I needed." One particularly quiet evening, as they sat watching the sunset together, Margaret turned to Jason and said, "Promise me one thing. Promise me that when I am gone, you won't let sadness consume you. Promise me you'll live, you'll keep building, and you'll carry our story as proof that love is real." Jason's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. "I promise. Our love will never end, Margaret. It will live in me forever." Though her health declined, Margaret's spirit remained strong. She lived each day with gratitude, cherishing every smile, every laugh, every quiet moment with Jason. And when the time eventually came for her to say goodbye, she left this world knowing she had been loved in the purest way possible. Jason mourned her deeply, but he did not forget his promise. He continued to live with dignity, carrying their story as a light in his heart. Whenever people asked him about Margaret, he would smile and say, "She was my greatest gift. She taught me that love has no age, no boundary, and no end." In the town, their story became something people spoke about for years. Some called it unusual, others called it extraordinary, but all agreed it was real. Margaret and Jason had shown that love is not bound by time, age, or expectation. It is bound only by honesty, kindness, and the courage to follow the heart. For those who had once doubted them, their love became a lesson. For those who believed in them, it became an inspiration. And for Jason, it became the foundation of his life. He carried on, building his business, helping others, and always remembering the woman who had given him purpose and joy. Their story was not a fairy tale in the traditional sense. It had challenges, struggles, and tears. But it was real, and that made it far more powerful than any perfect tale. It showed that love could be found in unexpected ways, and that sometimes, the most unlikely relationships hold the deepest truths. And so, the lesson of Margaret and Jason lived on. True happiness is not measured by what others think, but by what the heart feels. Age may wrinkle the skin, but it can never wrinkle the soul. Where there is love, there is life, and where there is courage, there is a story that inspires generations.